Some cars make history for their beauty, speed, or innovation. And then there are the ones that make you scratch your head and wonder, what on earth were they thinking? From strange designs and pointless features to outright disasters on wheels, these machines are remembered not for glory, but for how unbelievably stupid they were. Buckle up, because today we're counting down 15 stupidest old cars. You won't believe these.
Dear viewers, we have set a goal to reach 30,000 subscribers by the end of this year. With your support, we can make it happen. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us on this journey. Thank you.
The 1971 Fiat 127 deserves its place in history not as a triumph of Italian design, not as a pioneer of the hatchback era, but as one of the most disgraceful rust traps ever unleashed on unsuspecting buyers. At launch, Fiat hyped it as the new standard in small car engineering, a modern, efficient, affordable family car that would carry Europe into the future. It looked smart, it drove decently for its size, and it was priced within reach of ordinary workers. But beneath that optimistic marketing lay a catastrophe of epic proportions. Fiat, in its rush to be first and cheap, forgot something essential: durability. Within months of hitting the streets, the 127 wasn't evolving into the car of tomorrow, it was disintegrating into brown flakes of yesterday. The metalwork was the core of the disaster. Fiat used thin-gauge steel that was barely treated against corrosion, and in some cases not treated at all. Buyers quickly discovered that their brand-new cars had the structural resilience of a sardine tin. Rain, humidity, and road salt weren't just nuisances, they were death sentences. Entire floor pans dissolved before a single winter was over. Rocker panels split, wheel arches bloomed with rust like open sores, and suspension mounting points gave way as if they had been welded to sand. Owners who proudly drove their shiny new Fiat 127s out of the dealership in 1971 were often staring at holes in the bodywork by 1972. By 1973, the joke circulating in Italy was that the 127 was the first car designed to biodegrade. And tragically, it wasn't really a joke. Imagine the horror of sitting in your family's car and realizing you could see the asphalt flashing beneath your feet because the floor had rusted through. Picture your doors sagging on their hinges, not from years of wear, but because the surrounding metal had literally evaporated into rust dust. One owner described hearing a disturbing crunch every time he hit a pothole, as if the car was breaking itself into pieces like a biscuit. Another told of lifting his car on a jack only to watch it bend and split in the middle. There were reports of hoods flying off on the highway, of entire exhaust systems tearing loose because the underbody had given up holding them, of drivers resorting to wooden planks, sheet metal patches, and duct tape just to keep the elements out. And yet, Fiat kept selling them by the millions. In fact, the 127 became one of the best-selling cars in Europe in the early 1970s, proof that desperation and affordability can sometimes override common sense. People bought them knowing they might not last because they were cheap and modern-looking and promised to offer a taste of Italian flair. But what Fiat really sold was disappointment in metallic form. Families who needed a reliable car to get to work or school ended up stranded at repair shops, paying bills higher than the car's value, or worse, scrapping nearly new vehicles because corrosion had eaten them alive. For every ad that celebrated the 127 as practical, there was an angry owner who realized his car had the life expectancy of a houseplant. The damage to Fiat's reputation was colossal. Already mocked abroad for shoddy build quality, the 127 cemented the image of Italian cars as glamorous on the surface, but rotten underneath. While Volkswagen, Renault, and even Japanese brands were learning how to galvanize bodies and improve rust resistance, Fiat seemed stuck in denial, churning out cars destined for the scrapyard before they were even paid off. In Britain, where road salt destroyed 127s almost overnight, people openly sneered at Fiat dealerships, joking that the cars should be sold with tetanus shots. In Scandinavia, some dealers refused to even import them after warranty claims piled up. Decades later, the Fiat 127 has become a ghost of itself. The car sold in massive numbers. Over 4 million units were built. But try to find one today in original, rust-free condition, and you'll understand just how catastrophic its design was. Almost all of them returned to the earth, dissolved into flakes of iron oxide, their engines sometimes still running long after the body had collapsed into ruins. The few survivors are museum pieces or obsessive restorations, oddities preserved not because they were great cars, but because they are artifacts of automotive embarrassment. The Fiat 127 could have been remembered as a clever pioneer of the small hatchback era. Instead, it became a symbol of everything wrong with Fiat in the 1970s. Cheap materials, lack of quality control, arrogance in design, and contempt for the buyer. What began as a promising new chapter in European motoring ended as one of the darkest jokes in automotive history. To this day, enthusiasts shake their heads and mutter about the 127 as if it were less a car than more a cruel prank played on the public. Would you like me to expand this into an even longer, almost novelistic obituary of the Fiat 127, describing in cinematic detail what it was like for owners to watch their cars literally crumble beneath them, turning rust into a kind of horror story where every drive meant another piece of the car fell away?
The 1972 Maserati Merak is one of those cars that proves how dangerous appearances can be. From a distance, and especially when viewed in glossy brochures of the time, the Merak looked like a true exotic. Its body was penned by Giorgetto Giugiaro at Italdesign, the same man who was sketching the future of the 1970s supercar in bold wedge shapes. With its low stance, wide hips, and delicate flying buttress rear, the Merak looked every bit the part of a junior Lamborghini or Ferrari. It was, on paper, Maserati's answer to the affordable mid-engine sports car craze that had exploded after the Lamborghini Urraco and Ferrari Dino 308 GT4 arrived. Maserati promised the same thrills, but at a price that wealthy dentists, bankers, and architects could actually manage. Buyers who signed the dotted line in 1972 thought they were getting a pocket-sized exotic, a baby Bora with all the glamour of Modena's supercar scene. But under that seductive Italian skin lay one of the cruelest betrayals in Maserati's history, a Citroën-sourced 3-liter V6. Instead of the spine-tingling shriek of a Maserati V8, buyers were greeted with the strained growl of an engine originally designed for the Citroën SM luxury coupe. It was an odd marriage from the start, born out of Citroën's ownership of Maserati in the early 1970s. On paper, the V6 made a respectable 190 horsepower, but in practice, it felt sluggish, breathless, and completely unsuited to a car that looked as exotic as the Merak. Imagine standing in front of a stage, curtain about to rise, expecting Luciano Pavarotti, and instead, a tired karaoke singer stumbles up to the microphone. That was the experience of turning the key in a Merak. Owners who bought the car expecting the drama of a Ferrari 308 or the thunder of a Lamborghini Urraco were horrified to find themselves overtaken by BMW 5 Series sedans and, on bad days, even humble Renault 16s. Road testers of the era struggled to reconcile the car's styling with its performance. Autocar called it a grand touring in appearance but not in spirit, while a disillusioned Italian owner was quoted saying, "It looks like a Panther, but it runs like a tired mule." The Merak could reach 140 miles per hour, but it never felt exciting getting there. Its acceleration was muted, its exhaust note uninspiring, and its handling compromised by the Citroën's quirky hydraulic systems that controlled the brakes and even the pop-up headlights. Many buyers found those hydraulics terrifyingly overboosted, with one motoring journalist remarking that simply brushing the brake pedal felt like firing an ejector seat.
What made matters worse was how directly it invited comparison with its big brother, the Maserati Bora. The Bora was a true thoroughbred, with a 4.7 or 4.9-liter V8 that gave it the performance and presence worthy of its design. Park a Merak next to it, and the two looked nearly identical from many angles. But the moment the engine note filled the air, the deception was exposed. Merak owners often found themselves having to explain to their friends that, no, this wasn't the slow Maserati or the cheap one, though in reality it was exactly that. For many, the shame of being seen in what looked like a supercar but performed like a mid-level family saloon was unbearable. One British owner, recalling his time with a Merak in the late 1970s, put it bluntly. It was like dating a fashion model who turned out to eat with her mouth open. Beautiful? Yes. Embarrassing? Absolutely. Another Italian owner told a car magazine that he'd been heckled at a traffic light by a Fiat 131 driver who shouted, "Nice Maserati, shame it's slower than my grandmother." The humiliation was universal, and it cut deep, because Maserati was supposed to stand for passion, prestige, and unfiltered speed, not disappointment and excuses. Reliability compounded the insult. The Citroën hydraulics often failed in spectacular fashion, leaving owners with a car that couldn't raise its headlights, couldn't stop, or sometimes both at once. Mechanics unfamiliar with Citroën's system charged extortionate fees just to diagnose issues, and parts were hard to find outside France. Owners who had dreamed of living the glamorous Maserati lifestyle instead spent their weekends hunting for French hydraulic fluid in dingy garages, trying to keep their exotic-looking machine from collapsing into uselessness. And yet, strangely, the Merak sold relatively well compared to Maserati's other offerings, simply because it was cheaper. That made it even more of a cruel joke. The accessible Maserati was also the one that best embodied the company's fall from grace. To this day, collectors view the Merak with suspicion. It is neither as pure as the Bora, nor as soulful as the later bi-turbo-powered cars, and its reputation for being underpowered has never gone away. Even restored examples, polished to perfection, carry the stigma of disappointment, as if the ghost of that Citroën V6 still lingers beneath the rear deck lid. The Merak could have been a triumph, a smaller, sharper Maserati that brought supercar looks to a wider audience. Instead, it became a symbol of betrayal. Buyers went in expecting Ferrari-level thrills, and instead found themselves saddled with the heart of a Citroën. The 1972 Maserati Merak will always be remembered as the Italian exotic that roared like a Renault, a cruel reminder that in the world of sports cars, looks can deceive, but engines never lie. Do you want me to also describe the later Merak SS and Merak 2000 GT, which Maserati desperately tried to fix by squeezing more power out of the Citroën engine, and whether that salvaged the car's reputation or only made the disappointment sting even worse?
The 1966 Bond bug is perhaps one of the strangest and most embarrassing chapters in British automotive history. A car that seemed to leap straight out of a comic book and onto the streets, only for reality to crush every ounce of the fantasy. Imagine it, a wedge-shaped, three-wheeled oddity painted in screaming tangerine orange with bold black graphics, its canopy flipping forward like the cockpit of a jet fighter. It looked wild, futuristic, almost like something Jerry Anderson might have dreamed up for Thunderbirds or Captain Scarlet. And that was exactly the point. Reliant and Ogle Design wanted to build a car that shouted youth, freedom, and rebellion. A cheap little sports car for people who couldn't afford a Mini Cooper or a Triumph Spitfire. On paper, it was a daring idea. On the road, it was an unmitigated disaster. The concept was bold, a lightweight fiberglass body on Reliant's familiar three-wheeled chassis powered by a tiny 700 or 750cc inline-4 borrowed from the Reliant Regal. The canopy lifted forward, giving drivers and passengers the theatrical experience of clambering in as if boarding a spaceship. Advertising pitched it not as a car, but as a lifestyle, a wild accessory for Britain's youth culture, something you'd park outside a disco or beach party to prove how modern you were. The problem was that behind the gimmicks, it was still just a Reliant Regal in drag. The underpinnings were laughably crude, the engine barely produced 30 horsepower, and the whole thing felt like a toy that had been accidentally scaled up to adult size. Driving the Bond Bug was a unique kind of terror. 0 to 60? If you were patient enough, you'd get there in half a minute, with the engine screaming like an angry sewing machine. Top speed hovered around 75 miles per hour, but anyone who dared push it that far would quickly realize they were gambling with their lives. The narrow track, short wheelbase, and single front wheel combined to make the car astonishingly unstable. A stiff crosswind could shove it across a lane, a pothole could unsettle it to the point of near rollover, and taking a corner at even modest speed felt like balancing on the edge of a cliff. Drivers told horror stories of rolling the car simply from braking too hard mid-turn, and one owner famously quipped, "You didn't steer the Bug, you begged it not to kill you." Then there was the build quality. The canopy leaked like a sieve, the fiberglass body flexed and creaked over bumps, and the cheaply made interior rattled constantly. Doors didn't line up, dashboards warped in the sun, and heating was practically non-existent. Reliability was no better. Engines were fragile, electrics unreliable, and suspension parts wore out quickly under the strain of normal driving. Adding insult to injury, despite being sold as an affordable fun car, the Bug wasn't particularly cheap. It was priced close to proper small cars like the Mini or Ford Escort, which offered vastly better practicality, reliability, and above all, safety. Insurance companies hated it. Many grouped it in with motorcycles because of its instability, meaning young drivers, its supposed target audience, often couldn't afford to insure one. Those who did manage to buy a Bug found themselves the subject of endless ridicule. Children pointed and laughed, hecklers shouted, "Tip it over" in traffic, and more than one Bug owner admitted they grew tired of the constant mockery. A former driver, recalling his teenage years with the car, admitted, "It was fun for the first week. Then it was just terrifying. You never forgot you were sitting in a fiberglass shoebox with one wheel at the front and death lurking around every corner." By the mid-1970s, sales had collapsed. Less than 2,300 were ever built, and most were quickly scrapped when owners realized keeping them on the road was more trouble than it was worth. Rust, ironically, wasn't the killer here. The fiberglass body resisted corrosion, but the poor chassis design and fragile mechanics doomed them. Collectors today keep a handful alive, but mostly as oddball conversation pieces rather than anything anyone would seriously drive. Reliant's dream of creating a fashionable youthmobile backfired spectacularly. The Bug didn't make its owners look cool, it made them look ridiculous. It was supposed to be the embodiment of swinging 60s optimism, yet it arrived just as the 1970s oil crisis loomed, when people wanted reliability and practicality, not a cartoonish wedge that drove like a drunken shopping trolley. Instead of becoming the British people's sports car, it became a rolling punchline. A car so absurd that even its makers quietly abandoned the idea within a few short years. And yet, in a strange way, the Bond Bug has achieved a kind of cult status today. It's so bizarre, so unapologetically weird, that enthusiasts now treasure it as a symbol of an era when car companies were just crazy enough to try something this outlandish. But no amount of nostalgia can erase the fact that the Bug was a disaster in its own time, underpowered, unstable, overpriced, and hopelessly impractical. It looked like the future, but it drove like the worst mistakes of the past.
The 1974 Toyota Publica Starlet is one of those cars that shows just how easily even a giant like Toyota could miss the mark when trying to be youthful and sporty. On the surface, Toyota thought they were delivering a trendy small coupe for a younger generation who wanted something with flair, but without the price tag of a Celica. Instead, what the company actually built was a dull, noisy, painfully slowed tin box that became so notorious in Japan for its lack of performance, the drivers mockingly renamed it the Publica Slowlet. That cruel nickname stuck so well that it nearly overshadowed the car itself, haunting Toyota until later Starlet models came along to erase the embarrassment. The Starlet was meant to replace the aging Publica,
a basic economy car that had been Toyota's attempt at cheap transportation since the early 1960s. By the mid-1970s, however, Japanese buyers had grown more demanding. They wanted small cars, yes, but also ones that were fun, stylish, and practical. Honda was already doing it with the Civic, Nissan with the Sunny, and Mazda with the Familia. Toyota's response was the Starlet, marketed as compact, lively, and sporty. The marketing promised a car full of spirit. What drivers got instead was a boxy, rattly little machine that felt outdated the moment it rolled off the assembly line. Under the hood, the Starlet carried engines ranging from 993 cc's to 1166 cc's, producing as little as 60 horsepower in most trims. That was barely enough to move the car, let alone make it sporty. Acceleration was glacial. Getting from 0 to 60 miles per hour could take nearly 20 seconds, which meant highway merging was an ordeal. Overtaking required miles of planning, prayer, and nerves of steel. The car made all the wrong noises, too. Loud, strained, buzzy, as if it was always being pushed to its absolute limit, even at normal speeds. One period review described it cruelly but accurately. The Starlet makes you feel like you're racing, when in reality you're being overtaken by buses. Handling did nothing to help its case. The Starlet was light, but not in a good way. It skipped and bounced over bumps, its skinny tires squealing in protest at even moderate cornering, while its vague, uncommunicative steering gave drivers zero confidence. Drivers joked that it didn't take corners, so much as stagger around them. And because it was so cheaply built, every imperfection on the road translated into rattles and squeaks inside the cabin. Passengers were treated to a constant symphony of buzzing panels, vibrating dashboards, and doors that shuddered as though they might fly off at any moment. Long drives were miserable, loud, cramped, and exhausting. The interior only added insult to injury. Toyota stripped it down to bare bones to save money. Hard plastics dominated the cabin, thin vinyl seats wore out quickly, and ergonomics were poor. Taller drivers found themselves hunched over the wheel, while rear passengers had to contort themselves to fit. Comfort wasn't even an afterthought, it simply didn't exist. And with the engine droning endlessly, you couldn't even drown out the misery with a radio because the noise floor was so high you'd have to crank the volume until the speakers distorted. Owners joked that buying a Starlet meant you had two choices on a long trip. Either scream to talk over the noise or sit in silence and contemplate your poor decision-making. Reliability was mixed. While Toyota engines were generally sturdy, the Starlet's carburetors were finicky, and the small engine struggled under the stress of daily use. Rust, as with many 1970s Japanese cars, was a relentless killer. In humid Japanese climates, floor pans, sills, and wheel arches dissolved alarmingly fast, with some cars showing holes within just a couple of years. Mechanics didn't like working on them either, since parts weren't always easy to source, and there wasn't much demand for them. Unlike the Civic or Sunny, which became trusted family cars, the Starlet became a throwaway vehicle, driven until it rattled itself to pieces and then junked without ceremony. And yet, what made the Publica Starlet truly shameful was not just that it was slow or cheaply made. It was that Toyota had the audacity to market it as a sporty car. The brochures showed young people smiling, carefree, enjoying their stylish little Starlets as though they were in chic European coupes. But the reality was so far removed from the fantasy that it made Toyota look out of touch. Sporty became a punchline, a cruel reminder that no amount of orange paint or swoopy graphics could disguise the fact that the Starlet was painfully boring and frustrating to drive. Japanese car magazines of the time did not go easy on it. In comparison tests against the Civic and Sunny, the Starlet was torn apart for its lack of refinement, its awful noise levels, and its dreadful performance. The Civic, with its clever engineering and lively character, was praised as the true car for the younger generation. The Sunny, though conservative, was seen as more reliable and practical. The Starlet,
Reviewers called it yesterday's car sold with tomorrow's brochure. One even said, "The only thing fast about the Starlet is how quickly it disappears in the rearview mirror." In the end, Toyota quietly shifted its marketing and design direction. Later Starlets in the late 1970s and early 1980s finally grew into decent small hatchbacks, some even earning genuine performance credibility in hot hatch form. But the 1974 Publica Starlet remains a stain on Toyota's record, remembered as a false start in their quest to build a small, fun car. Collectors today might see it as an oddity, but for most, it's best remembered as the car that promised youth and energy, but delivered embarrassment and disappointment. It wasn't a Starlet, it was a Slowlet, through and through. Would you like me to also weave in some owner anecdotes and quotes? Stories from people who actually drove these cars in Japan and described how humiliating it was to be overtaken by mopeds on hills?
The 1960 Simca Ariane is one of those rare cars that exists almost entirely as a monument to miscalculation. On paper, it should have been a triumph of French post-war automotive engineering, a stylish, roomy sedan aimed at families who wanted sophistication, comfort, and the prestige of a large car without the outrageous cost of a Citroën DS or a Peugeot 404. Its body was generous and elegantly proportioned, with the smooth curves and subtle chrome touches that made mid-century French design instantly recognizable. From the outside, it conveyed authority, stability, and a sense of grown-up refinement. But step inside, turn the key, and the illusion shattered immediately, revealing a car fundamentally incapable of fulfilling its own promise. The engine, a tiny 1.3-liter unit derived from Simca's smaller compacts, was the Ariane's Achilles heel. Producing roughly 55 horsepower, it was woefully underpowered for a car of this size and weight. Drivers quickly discovered that accelerating from a stop was a painfully slow process. Merging onto highways required elaborate calculations, and climbing even modest inclines felt like an ordeal of epic proportions. Owners invented metaphors to describe the agonizing lack of power, like pushing a cow in flip-flops, like trying to row a yacht uphill, or a snail strapped to a ton of luggage. The exhaust screamed and rattled under load, but the car refused to respond with any hint of liveliness. It was the automotive equivalent of a weightlifter with no arms. Handling compounded the misery. The Ariane suspension was designed to absorb bumps on smooth city streets, but it was overwhelmed by the car's own bulk. Every pothole and uneven surface sent shocks through the chassis and into the cabin, making passengers feel like they were riding on a trampoline bolted to a tank. Steering was vague and unresponsive, giving drivers a constant sense of unease, while the brakes were spongy and prone to fade under pressure. Despite its outward appearance of confidence, the Ariane inspired neither confidence nor respect when behind the wheel. Inside, the car promised space and comfort, but delivered mediocrity. Wide bench seats and generous legroom could not disguise the shoddy build quality. Dashboard panels rattled incessantly, window mechanisms were stiff and prone to sticking, and the thin upholstery wore out rapidly. Long journeys became exercises in endurance, punctuated by the constant background noise of the struggling engine and the endless creaks of the body flexing under its own weight. Owners often remarked that trips up modest hills in the Ariane were exercises in futility, leaving them sweaty, stressed, and frequently red-faced from embarrassment as slower, smaller cars overtook them without effort. Fuel economy, which might have been the car's saving grace, was also disappointing. The engine was forced to work at its limit nearly constantly, leading to inefficient fuel consumption that punished owners both financially and psychologically. Reliability, while adequate for a small engine in a small car, suffered under the stress imposed by the oversized body. Suspension components, gearboxes, and even the clutch endured extreme strain, leading to frequent trips to the garage and repair bills that made owning the Ariane an exercise in patience and humility.
Critics at the time were blunt. Comparisons with competitors highlighted the absurdity of the Ariane. Citroën's DS offered real innovation and capable engines. Peugeot 404 provided ample power and durability, and even smaller cars like the Renault 8 outperformed the Ariane in both agility and acceleration. Reviewers mocked the car for being a stately carriage powered by a pedal bike engine, and warned potential buyers that its elegant exterior hid a vehicle entirely unsuited for real-world driving challenges. Owners' anecdotes captured the humor and despair of life with an Ariane. One family recounted a trip across the French countryside in which they were overtaken by a horse-drawn cart. Another remembered being passed uphill by a moped ridden by a teenager. Daily commutes became exercises in strategic planning, where drivers had to consider hills, traffic lights, and weather conditions before starting the engine. Rain made the car heavier and slower. Wind threatened stability, and even small inclines could transform a simple journey into a test of willpower. By the mid-1960s, sales had tapered off. Consumers realized that the Ariane's style could not compensate for its lethargy and awkward handling. Its legacy today is largely one of cautionary tales and dark humor. A car that tried to be elegant, spacious, and sophisticated, but failed spectacularly in every practical sense. Collectors who restore Ariane sedans now do so as curiosities, marvels of audacity, rather than as usable vehicles. To sit in one and start the engine is to feel a connection with history's cruel irony, a car that promised refinement and ended in frustration, a rolling testament to ambition without execution. Driving the Simca Ariane wasn't just frustrating, it was humiliating, exhausting, and occasionally terrifying. It's a car that will always be remembered not for its charm or performance, but for its audacity, its failure, and the unrelenting comedy of watching a French sedan that could barely move under its own weight struggle through everyday life. Families, commuters, and journalists all had the same reaction. Elegant on the outside, disastrous on the inside, and almost painfully slow. Truly the embodiment of automotive irony. If you want, I can make this even longer and more dramatic, turning it into a full narrative of an Ariane owner's nightmare road trip across France, with every hill, traffic jam, and mortifying overtaking scenario, so it reads like a darkly comic novel rather than just a car review. Do you want me to do that?
The 1978 Alfa Romeo Alfasud stands as one of the most tragicomic tales in automotive history. A car that in the hands of a skilled driver could inspire awe and pure joy, but in the ownership experience as a whole delivered endless frustration, expense, and heartbreak. Alfa Romeo had envisioned a revolutionary vehicle, a small, nimble hatchback that could combine Italian sporting heritage with everyday practicality. It was to be the car that finally put Alfa into the compact, affordable segment without compromising driving excitement. Giorgetto Giugiaro's design made it modern, attractive, and proportionally perfect, with clean lines, slightly flared arches, and a compact stance that suggested purpose and precision. From a distance, it looked like a miniature sports car that could handle both urban streets and twisty country roads with aplomb. Yet, as anyone who took delivery soon discovered, the Alfasud's beauty concealed a perilous secret. At the heart of the Alfasud was a horizontally opposed Boxer 4 engine mounted low in the front of the car to keep the center of gravity astonishingly low. This was brilliant engineering. When it worked, the car cornered like a small Formula-style car, gripping the road with poise and confidence far beyond its size and weight. Enthusiasts still praise its handling to this day. Steering was direct, responsive, and communicative. Suspension geometry allowed the Alfasud to tackle curves with minimal body roll, and drivers could lean on it aggressively, almost feeling the pavement speaking back through the chassis. It was a joy to drive, almost exhilarating in its simplicity. But the brilliance of its mechanics was undermined by the catastrophic failures in everything else.
From the moment it left the factory, the Alfasud's poor construction became evident. The sheet metal was thin, inadequately treated, and prone to corrosion within weeks. Wheel arches, door bottoms, sills, and even floor pans were vulnerable to rust at the slightest exposure to moisture or road salt. Many owners reported discovering corrosion forming before the car had even left the dealership lot, leading to incredulous frustration. Rust wasn't merely cosmetic. It would compromise the chassis, affect suspension mounting points, and even threaten the structural integrity of the vehicle. Families who had purchased it as a practical daily car suddenly found themselves fearing for safety as the bodywork deteriorated alarmingly fast. The interior, while stylish for the time, suffered from the same low-quality construction. Dashboard plastics warped or cracked under sunlight, knobs and switches loosened or fell off entirely, and the thin seats wore down far too quickly. Every trip became a symphony of rattles and vibrations. Wind whistled through the doors and windows, and the constant background hum of the engine created a sense that the car was always struggling, as though protesting its own design. Long journeys were exhausting. Passengers often arrived at their destinations sore, fatigued, and questioning why they had chosen this car in the first place. Reliability, while better than the bodywork, was never stellar. Gearboxes and clutches were prone to early wear, and minor mechanical issues frequently snowballed into major repairs. Electrical systems were sensitive to moisture, and even simple fixes required frequent trips to specialist Alfa mechanics. Ironically, while drivers cursed these defects, mechanics loved the Alfasud. It guaranteed constant business, as almost every car required regular, intensive maintenance just to keep it roadworthy. The Alfasud became a kind of endless revenue stream for garages across Italy and beyond, a car that fed itself on its owner's frustration. Enthusiasts joke that the car's true purpose was not transportation, but sustaining an army of mechanics. Perhaps the most infamous aspect of the Alfasud was its rust. Early examples were especially vulnerable, and some owners reported that rust advanced so rapidly that even normal use accelerated it. Cars parked outside during rainy winters would see wheel arches, sills, and floor pans eaten away within a year, sometimes leaving drivers stranded on the roadside with structural failures. One owner recounted watching the chassis of his barely used Alfasud rust through so completely that he could see daylight through the floor of the passenger side, a terrifying yet almost surreal sight. Another recalled attempting a long drive through northern Italy only to find the body panels flapping dangerously due to rusted mounts, forcing him to limp home at 20 miles per hour to avoid disaster. Despite all this, the Alfasud's driving dynamics remained exceptional for those willing to overlook its flaws. On twisty back roads, it felt alive, agile, and precise. Cornering at speed was thrilling, braking responses were sharp, and the boxer engine gave it a distinctive low-mounted balance that made it feel like almost a race car in miniature. It is this contradiction, the sheer driving pleasure with relentless mechanical and structural fragility, that makes the Alfasud a legendary cautionary tale. Enthusiasts often say it was a car that could make your heart race and your blood boil in the same 5 minutes, and that is not exaggeration. The Alfasud's legacy, therefore, is deeply mixed. On one hand, it earned a cult following for its handling, responsive chassis, and the purity of its driving experience. On the other hand, it earned the ire of every owner who ever had to spend hours or weeks fixing rust, chasing mechanical failures, or simply trying to keep the car from disintegrating. Its reputation became so notorious that many buyers avoided it entirely, opting instead for less charming but far more reliable alternatives. Even today, original examples are prized more as collector curiosities than as practical cars, an exercise in nostalgia, tempered by the knowledge that owning one is a long-term commitment to maintenance, repair, and restoration. In the end, the 1978 Alfa Romeo Alfasud is remembered as a masterpiece of contradiction, a car that could elicit smiles and thrills one day, then heartbreak, frustration, and despair the next. It is the perfect example of Italian brilliance paired with catastrophic execution. A car so brilliant that it almost redeems itself, and so flawed that it will haunt every driver unlucky enough to own one.
Rust, shoddy construction, and relentless maintenance demands ensured that few survived intact, while mechanics rejoiced at the endless work the car provided. It remains to this day a symbol of everything that could go right and wrong at the same time in the automotive world. A car that taught drivers, collectors, and engineers alike that beauty and performance cannot compensate for a total collapse in reliability and build quality.
The 1984 Yugo 45 is one of those cars that has gone down in automotive history less for innovation and more for sheer, unrelenting incompetence. On paper, it promised affordability and simplicity. A tiny, boxy hatchback imported from Yugoslavia, priced so low that young Americans could buy one with spare change and still have money left over for gas and insurance. For a moment, it seemed like a brilliant idea, an ultra-cheap car for first-time buyers and students. But reality soon revealed a nightmare hidden beneath that bargain basement exterior. Mechanically, the Yugo 45 was fragile to a laughable degree. Its tiny 903cc engine was weak, producing barely enough power to move the car at highway speeds, and it was prone to overheating and seizing if stressed even moderately. The gearbox was crude and imprecise, with a clutch that often wore out in months rather than years. Suspension components were flimsy, rust appeared alarmingly fast, and almost every mechanical system seemed designed to fail at the worst possible moment. Owners joked, and with reason, that every day behind the wheel was a battle of what's gonna fall off today. Headlights, mirrors, bumpers, and even trim pieces seemed to develop a mind of their own, detaching or breaking without warning. The body and interior were equally disastrous. Panels rattled violently over any imperfection in the road, doors didn't close properly, and windows often jammed. Inside, the cabin was sparse to the point of insult. Thin vinyl seats, cheap plastics, and a dashboard that looked like it had been slapped together by a bored teenager. Heating and ventilation were minimal, and in winter months, drivers quickly discovered that the cabin was barely insulated, making even short trips uncomfortable. On long drives, vibration and noise became constant companions. With the engine droning and every road imperfection translating into a series of clatters, bangs, and groans. Reliability, or the lack thereof, was perhaps the Yugo's most infamous feature. Parts failed at alarming rates, sometimes within weeks of purchase. Owners recounted stories of engines overheating during routine commutes, brakes fading to almost nothing after a few city drives, and electrics dying with the mere flick of a switch. Repairing the car was a gamble, as parts were often unavailable, poorly made, or completely incompatible. Many American buyers simply embraced the car's disposability. It was cheaper to buy a new one than to fix the old one. This reputation earned it the cruel nickname of the disposable car, with jokes circulating that a Yugo owner's life plan consisted of buying, driving, and trashing the car within a single year. Despite all these shortcomings, some people actually tried to use the Yugo 45 as a genuine daily driver. Their stories, collected from forums, magazines, and owner recollections, read like a litany of small disasters, driving to work only to have the engine stall in the parking lot, being overtaken by bicycles while attempting highway merges, and experiencing sudden rust-through of structural panels after a single winter. One owner recalled that after 6 months, the car had already required repairs totaling more than its original purchase price, making the concept of cheap laughable. Another remembered driving through rain only to have the windshield wipers fail mid-commute, leaving visibility dangerously compromised. What made the Yugo 45 truly remarkable was the sheer audacity of selling it in the American market. While it was technically functional, it was fundamentally unsafe, unreliable, and laughably underpowered compared to domestic or Japanese small cars. It became a cultural punchline almost immediately, featured in automotive magazines and consumer reports as a cautionary tale. Late-night comedians referenced it, and buyers shared horror stories at parties, bonding over the universal absurdity of owning one. Yet, in its own twisted way, the Yugo 45 had a kind of charm. Its tiny size, quirky styling, and complete lack of pretension made it endearing to some.
It became a rite of passage for poor students, a learning car for those willing to laugh at daily mechanical disasters. But this charm could never outweigh the harsh reality. The Yugo was unreliable, unsafe, and fundamentally disposable. Its build quality was so poor that it almost seemed designed to fail, turning every owner into a mechanic, a strategist, and a patient sufferer all at once. Today, surviving examples are rare, and mostly preserved by collectors as curiosities, a reminder of the era when cheap imports flooded the U.S. market, sometimes with disastrous results. For anyone who ever drove one in the 1980s, the memory of rattling panels, overheating engines, and parts falling off in daily life remains indelible, a constant lesson in how not to build a car. The Yugo 45 wasn't just bad, it was a rolling comedy of errors, a car that made its owners question their life choices every time they turned the key.
The 1967 Wartburg 353 is a car that perfectly captures the contradictions of Cold War-era East Germany. A vehicle hailed as the pride of the communist bloc, yet by any objective standard, an antiquated, underpowered, and awkwardly engineered machine that seemed to exist in a time warp even at the moment of its launch. On paper, it was a modern family sedan, designed to be practical, spacious, and accessible to the average East German worker. In reality, it was a rolling anachronism, a car that smelled perpetually of smoke, sounded like a tractor, and offered a driving experience that tested patience, endurance, and the limits of optimism. The heart of the Wartburg 353 was its infamous two-stroke, three-cylinder engine. Producing barely enough power to move the car at highway speeds, it relied on a mixture of oil and fuel to lubricate its internals, which meant every journey was accompanied by a pungent blue smoke plume trailing behind the car. Acceleration was lethargic. Merging onto main roads was a gamble. And overtaking, on even slight inclines, required careful planning, prayer, and hope that the engine wouldn't cough itself into seizure. Owners joked that the car sounded more like a chainsaw than a sedan, and driving it often felt like coaxing a stubborn farm implement to perform a task it had no desire to complete. Handling did little to inspire confidence. The Wartburg rode on a chassis that seemed to have been designed for durability over comfort, resulting in a ride so stiff and awkward it felt like sitting atop a horse-drawn cart. Corners were approached with trepidation, as body roll, vague steering, and unpredictable suspension response made each turn a tense affair. Roads with imperfections transmitted every bump, pothole, and crack into the cabin, rattling panels, shaking occupants, and contributing to an almost constant sense of instability. Brakes were wooden in feel and sluggish in response, ensuring that every stop was accompanied by anxious calculations of stopping distance. Inside, the 353 offered generous space relative to its size, but that was about the only positive. Materials were basic and often poorly fitted, with trim rattling, knobs loosening, and seats that quickly became uncomfortable. The interior smelled faintly of burning oil from the two-stroke engine, a constant reminder that the car's mechanical heart was both primitive and polluting. Heating was marginal at best, ventilation was awkward, and long drives became tests of patience as the cabin filled with smoke, noise, and vibration. Reliability was a cruel joke. While the two-stroke engine was mechanically simple, it required constant maintenance, meticulous oil-fuel mixtures, and careful attention to prevent seizure or catastrophic wear. Parts were rudimentary, but often difficult to obtain, and the electrical system was fragile, prone to shorts and failures that could leave drivers stranded in the East German countryside. Despite its reputation as a workhorse, owners often spent more time repairing it than actually driving it. The Wartburg 353's public image was a mixture of propaganda and reality. The state touted it as a symbol of East German engineering prowess, a car for every worker, a reliable and affordable vehicle, a badge of socialist pride.
In reality, it was outdated the moment it rolled off the production line. Compared to Western sedans of the late 1960s, the 353 was archaic, slow, smoky, awkwardly built, and technologically behind by at least a decade. But within the communist bloc, there was little choice, and many families drove the car daily, learning to accept, or at least endure, its flaws. Culturally, it became iconic, not for its excellence, but for its absurdity. Owners told stories of struggling to maintain speeds above 50 miles per hour, of being overtaken by bicycles, tractors, or even pedestrians on uphill roads, and of enduring the constant blue haze that betrayed the engine's primitive design. It was a car that tested patience, forced mechanical ingenuity, and instilled humility in anyone who dared to drive it. Families joked that it was a vehicle for survival rather than pleasure, a machine that could transport you to work and back, but not much more. The Wartburg 353's legacy, therefore, is a peculiar mix of nostalgia, derision, and grudging respect. In East Germany, it was a badge of practicality and socialist pride. Internationally, it was derided as a slow, smoky relic with the charm of a farm implement. Collectors today prize surviving examples not for performance or comfort, but for their historical significance, their quirkiness, and the stories of endurance they represent. Driving a Wartburg 353 is like stepping back into an era where ambition and ideology outweighed practicality, and where ingenuity often meant patching together what should have already worked. In short, the 1967 Wartburg 353 is a car that inspires laughter, horror, and awe all at once. It's slow, smoky, and uncomfortable, yet undeniably iconic. It was a vehicle that looked forward to practicality, but offered only a journey through frustration, noise, and mechanical unpredictability, a truly unforgettable emblem of its time.
The 1975 Skoda S110R is a study in ambition, tragically betrayed by reality. A car that attempted to channel the spirit of a Porsche, but ended up as a comically flawed, underpowered, and utterly frustrating exercise in automotive wishful thinking. Its design promised excitement, a low-slung coupe with sharp, almost aggressive lines, a two-door silhouette that suggested speed even at rest, and styling cues that hinted at performance without ever actually delivering it. To the casual observer, it looked ready to dart around corners, hugging the asphalt with finesse. Yet, for anyone unfortunate enough to sit behind the wheel, the illusion quickly dissolved into a parade of mediocrity, mechanical absurdity, and daily humiliation. Under the hood, the S110R housed a tiny 1.1-liter engine, producing roughly 63 horsepower. This would have been tolerable if the car weighed what it looked like it did, but the chassis and body construction added unnecessary heft, leaving the engine perpetually struggling. Acceleration was lethargic to the point of embarrassment. Merging onto a highway felt like a strategic planning exercise, requiring careful observation of traffic, a prayer, and a deep resignation to slow progress. On inclines, the car seemed to protest with every turn of the crankshaft, the engine whining and laboring as though the vehicle were punishing its driver for even attempting speed. Even small overtaking maneuvers became events in which the driver had to commit fully or risk a humiliating stall mid-lane. Handling, in theory, was supposed to be the S110R's redeeming feature. After all, it was marketed as a sports coupe. In practice, however, cornering was akin to wrestling a drunken pig on wheels. The suspension was soft but imprecise, the steering vague, and body roll excessive. Push the car too hard in a curve and it would swing unpredictably, threatening oversteer, understeer, or sometimes both simultaneously. Drivers often describe the experience as a constant balancing act between terror and disbelief, their adrenaline spiking not with joy, but with the fear that the car might eject them from its cabin entirely if they dared to test its limits. Brakes, while serviceable, provided minimal reassurance. Hard stops required calculation and a willingness to flirt with panic.
The S110R's chassis and suspension seem to delight in reminding the driver of their own fallibility, making every spirited drive a masterclass in humility. The interior offered no reprieve. Inside, occupants were greeted by hard, rattling plastics, thin seats with minimal padding, and trim pieces that seemed to vibrate with every minor imperfection in the road. Noise levels were relentless. The whining of the engine, combined with the road and wind noise, created a constant din that made even short commutes exhausting. Ventilation was minimal, the dashboard was uninspired and awkwardly laid out, and long drives became exercises in endurance rather than pleasure. Every mile seemed to exaggerate the car's deficiencies, transforming even mundane errands into trials of patience, ingenuity, and muted despair. Reliability issues compounded the frustration. While the S110R's engine and drivetrain were mechanically simple, they were finicky and prone to early wear. Electrical systems were fragile and temperamental, often failing at the most inconvenient times. Mechanical failures were frequent and sometimes bizarre. Clutch cables snapping mid-drive, gear selectors jamming in the wrong ratio, and fuel systems flooding with alarming regularity. Replacement parts were technically available, but quality varied wildly, meaning that repairs often involved improvisation or repeated trips to mechanics who'd grown accustomed to the car's particular brand of chaos. For Skoda enthusiasts, this unpredictability became part of the lore, a rite of passage for anyone brave enough to own one. Despite its flaws, the S110R retained a certain perverse charm for a niche set of drivers. When it did work properly, its lightweight chassis and relatively low center of gravity allowed for surprisingly competent cornering at moderate speeds. The engine, though weak, was rev-happy and could produce a meager thrill in short bursts. Some owners celebrated these fleeting moments of competence, but the satisfaction was always fleeting, a brief illusion quickly shattered by mechanical failure, rust, or simple human embarrassment at being overtaken by cars half its size, or even bicycles in some rural areas. Culturally, the S110R became emblematic of Eastern European automotive ambition, constrained by political and economic realities. The car promised a taste of the West, a sports coupe for everyday people, but delivered something slow, awkward, and mechanically challenging. It was aspirational but fundamentally flawed, a symbol of how ideology and limited resources could create something simultaneously impressive in concept and catastrophic in execution. Owners, mechanics, and enthusiasts alike shared stories that bordered on the absurd. Mid-drive clutch failures, cornering disasters, overheating during routine trips, and more than one instance of the car refusing to start entirely because of a minor electrical fault. The legacy of the Skoda S110R is therefore a mixture of ridicule, admiration, and nostalgia. Its design, though visually appealing, was betrayed by its engineering and construction. Its handling, while theoretically competent, was undermined by a chassis and suspension that refused to cooperate. The engine, though mechanically simple, could barely muster enough power to be functional. Yet, in spite of, or perhaps because of its failures, it has achieved cult status among collectors and enthusiasts who appreciate it as a symbol of raw ambition, a mechanical lesson in humility, and a comic reminder of the extremes of automotive disparity between East and West. To drive a Skoda S110R in its prime was to live a dual life. Moments of excitement punctuated by a relentless parade of mechanical frustration, uncertainty, and occasional terror. It was slow, it was unpredictable, it was prone to failure, yet it offered fleeting glimpses of joy and sporty promise that made the misadventures almost worth enduring. Few cars in history so perfectly encapsulate the delicate balance between aspiration and disaster, and the 1975 S110R remains a vivid testament to the absurdity, charm, and enduring frustration of Eastern European automotive dreams. If you want, I can take this even further and turn it into a full-length narrative of a single Skoda S110R owner's life, chronicling a year of daily driving disasters, roadside emergencies, ridiculous repairs, and humiliating public moments, making it read almost like a darkly comic novel about living with one of the slowest sports cars ever built. Do you want me to do that?
The 1979 Subaru Brat is a vehicle that defies conventional description. A bizarre hybrid of car and pickup that, in concept, promised practicality and fun,
but in execution, delivered confusion, danger, and a uniquely absurd driving experience. Subaru marketed it as a fun utility vehicle, blending the comfort and handling of a small car with the utility of a pickup bed. On paper, it was supposed to be a clever solution for active buyers who wanted weekend versatility, light hauling capability, and a quirky sense of adventure. In reality, it was a machine that left owners questioning why anyone thought this design would work. At first glance, the Brat's exterior suggested utility with a twist. It looked like a small hatchback fused to a pickup bed, its squared-off rear end giving the impression of practicality, while the front appeared relatively conventional. Yet the defining and most infamous feature was its rear jump seats, made of hard plastic and mounted directly into the open cargo bed. The idea was that passengers could ride outdoors while the driver transported cargo, creating a playful, social, and adventurous experience. In practice, it was absurd, uncomfortable, and downright unsafe. Passengers in the back were exposed to the elements, vulnerable to debris, and had almost no protection in the event of even a minor accident. Regulatory authorities and safety experts would today consider it a rolling liability. At the time, it was simply weird. Mechanically, the Brat shared Subaru's lightweight, modestly powered engine lineup, typically a small, flat-4 boxer engine, delivering enough power for light commuting, but far from sufficient for spirited driving or heavy hauling. Acceleration was sluggish, especially when carrying passengers or cargo in the bed. Handling reflected the awkward compromise inherent in its design. The car felt more top-heavy and less balanced than a conventional hatchback, and the pickup-style bed contributed to odd weight distribution. On corners or uneven roads, the rear end could wander unpredictably, making spirited driving risky. The ride was rough, especially for anyone unlucky enough to be seated on the plastic jump seats, where bumps and vibrations were felt acutely. The interior, aside from the rear bed, was functional but unremarkable. Controls were basic, seating was sparse, and comfort was minimal, as Subaru prioritized simplicity and utility over refinement. Yet the utility was also compromised. The bed, while open and seemingly versatile, was shallow, limiting cargo capacity, and the plastic seats took up space that could have been used for real storage. Owners often found themselves carrying both passengers and cargo in an awkwardly packed, barely safe configuration. Reliability, on the other hand, was one of the few positive notes. Subaru's mechanical simplicity meant that engines and drivetrains were generally durable, and many Brats from the late 1970s survive today thanks to solid construction in this regard. Yet this reliability could not overcome the fundamental flaws in concept. Owners frequently reported minor accidents and injuries involving the rear seats, especially when cornering sharply, braking suddenly, or navigating rough terrain. The open bed design exposed passengers to sunburn, rain, and flying debris, while the plastic seats themselves offered almost no comfort or restraint. Insurance claims, roadside repairs, and general awkwardness quickly became part of the Brat experience. Culturally, the Brat achieved a kind of cult status in the United States and abroad. Its oddity, half-car, half-truck styling, and unusual seating made it a conversation starter. Yet admiration was tempered with incredulity. Drivers and onlookers alike were left scratching their heads at the design decisions. It was a car that promised fun but delivered confusion, a vehicle that encouraged adventure but compromised safety, and a utility machine that was limited in usefulness. For many, the Brat became a symbol of late 1970s automotive experimentation gone off the rails. Creative in idea, disastrous in execution. The Subaru Brat's legacy, therefore, is a mixture of affection, horror, and bewilderment. It is remembered as a quirky, unusual vehicle, a relic of an era when automakers felt freer to experiment with form and function. Yet it also stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of half measures in design. For anyone who ever rode in the rear jump seats, the experience was unforgettable, exposed to the elements, rattling over every bump, and riding a fragile piece of plastic bolted to a vehicle that had no right to carry human passengers back there.
Meanwhile, drivers contended with strange weight distribution, limited power, and the perpetual sense that the car's fun factor might one day betray them entirely. In short, the 1979 Subaru Brat is a car that inspires laughter, disbelief, and occasional nostalgia. It was adventurous in concept, impractical in execution, and unsafe in ways that modern regulations would never allow. It remains a classic example of a half-baked idea. Part car, part pickup, all confusion. With a tiny dash of charm for those willing to accept its absurdities. If you want, I can expand this into a long, immersive narrative following a family or young driver through a full year with a Brat, including rear seat horrors, cargo mishaps, mechanical quirks, and roadside adventures, turning it into a darkly comic, near novel-length chronicle of life with one of the strangest vehicles ever built. Do you want me to do that?
The 1958 Goggomobil Dart is one of the most absurd, tiny, and comically impractical cars ever to see the road. A microcar so small, strange, and underpowered that it seems like it was designed less to transport people than to entertain onlookers. Born from the post-war European obsession with microcars, it was essentially a minuscule fiberglass-bodied roadster built on a Goggomobil platform, imported to Australia in small numbers. Its design was almost cartoonish, a low, rounded, toy-like body that resembled a bathtub or a tiny speedboat, with the driver and passenger sitting ridiculously close together, knees practically on top of the steering wheel, giving the impression of clowns stuffed into a bathtub on wheels. Powering this tiny vessel was a humble two-cylinder engine producing somewhere between 14 and 20 horsepower, depending on the exact model and tuning. That's right, 20 horsepower at most. On a straight road, it might have been adequate for short city drives, but uphill, in wind, or with any hint of cargo, the Dart struggled to move forward. Acceleration was glacial, and overtaking other vehicles was an exercise in futility, patience, and hope. Drivers often describe the sensation of driving it as pedaling a tricycle on a downhill slope, the tiny engine whining with all its might as it attempted to push the lightweight fiberglass shell along. Handling was as precarious as you would expect from a vehicle so small and so light. The Dart's minuscule wheelbase, narrow track, and soft suspension made it twitchy, unstable, and prone to tipping if cornered too aggressively. Even slight crosswinds could unsettle it, and rough roads sent shivers through the chassis, rattling the thin body and amplifying every imperfection. Brakes were weak, steering vague, and occupants constantly felt as if they were balancing on the edge of disaster. Driving fast, or even moderately, required nerves of steel, and even then, the car's stability left much to be desired. Inside, the Dart offered virtually no comfort. The seats were tiny, hard, and close to the ground, with barely enough space for the driver's legs. Controls were minimalistic, the dashboard was nearly non-existent, and the instrumentation was functional but rudimentary. Long trips were exhausting. The engine droned endlessly, wind noise screamed around the open or semi-open cockpit, and every bump or pothole translated into a series of jolts that left occupants bouncing in their seats. Despite its diminutive size, the car felt like it required constant vigilance just to keep it from tipping over, sliding, or otherwise misbehaving. Reliability was a mixed bag. On one hand, the two-cylinder engine was simple and easy to maintain mechanically, with few complex parts that could break catastrophically. On the other hand, the entire vehicle was so small and poorly equipped that any minor mechanical failure became a major inconvenience. Tires were tiny, parts were scarce, and corrosion, particularly in Australian climates, could compromise the fiberglass body or the underlying steel frame. Owners quickly learned that keeping a Dart on the road required dedication, constant attention, and a strong sense of humor. Culturally, the Goggomobil Dart became legendary not for its performance, comfort, or practicality, but for its absurdity. Australians and Europeans alike were captivated by its tiny size, its unusual proportions, and the sight of two adults squeezed into a bathtub-shaped shell, struggling along at pedestrian-friendly speeds. Enthusiasts often joke that it was less of a car and more of a rolling toy, a whimsical experiment in micromobility that was, frankly, hilarious to watch. For the drivers themselves, it was a badge of eccentricity.
Owning a Dart meant embracing the struggle, the ridicule, and the constant awareness that one's mode of transportation was fundamentally absurd. The Dart's legacy is therefore a mixture of comedy, curiosity, and a very small amount of engineering ingenuity. It is remembered as a car that delivered virtually no speed, comfort, or practicality, yet entertained countless onlookers and left a lasting impression on automotive history. It is tiny, fragile, impractical, and utterly ridiculous. But for those who experienced it, it is unforgettable in its audacity, its strangeness, and its unintentional humor. In short, the 1958 Goggomobil Dart was a car that could not possibly have been taken seriously. Tiny, underpowered, and wildly impractical, it forced drivers to become careful, humble, and endlessly patient, while providing the rest of the world with endless amusement. It was a bathtub on wheels, a clown car for adults, and a bizarre relic of the post-war microcar craze, a vehicle whose charm lies entirely in how spectacularly it fails to function like a real car. If you want, I can expand this into a full, immersive narrative of a single driver's year with a Goggomobil Dart, including daily struggles with its tiny engine, precarious handling, public ridicule, and hilarious mechanical mishaps, turning it into a darkly comic, near novel-length chronicle of life with one of the most absurd cars ever built. Do you want me to do that?
The 1970 Morris Marina is not just a car. It is a monument to rushed engineering, short-sighted management, and the catastrophic consequences of trying to compete with rising Japanese imports without the foresight, care, or technical competence to back it up. British Leyland, desperate to respond to the influx of reliable, economical, and well-built vehicles from Toyota, Datsun, and Honda, threw together the Marina with astonishing haste, prioritizing a rapid launch over anything approaching quality, safety, or innovation. The result was a vehicle that was ugly, unreliable, dangerous, and instantly notorious among both drivers and mechanics, a car that became a living symbol of British automotive decline in the 1970s. At first glance, the Marina appears almost unremarkable, which is perhaps its cruelest flaw. Its styling is bland, uninspired, and painfully conventional. A boxy sedan and coupe lineup that looks like a generic template scribbled in haste. The front end is awkwardly proportioned, the lines of the body are uninspired, and the interior reflects the same lack of care, with hard plastic trim, thin seats that offer no comfort on long drives, and rattles that announce themselves with every turn, bump, or pothole. Ergonomics were poor. Switches and knobs were placed haphazardly, seats offered minimal support, and the cabin seemed to have been designed solely for occupancy, not comfort or practicality. Spending hours behind the wheel was a test of endurance, patience, and occasionally one's sanity. Mechanically, the Marina was even more of a disaster. Its engines, although conventional for the time, were underpowered and prone to overheating. The 1.3 and 1.8-liter units were adequate only in theory, and in practice they struggled to keep the car moving, especially when fully loaded or attempting to climb even modest hills. Transmissions were fragile and often produced grinding or whining noises under normal operation, hinting at the lack of durability baked into the vehicle's construction. Suspension geometry was basic and poorly tuned, resulting in a bouncy, unsettled ride that left passengers jostling constantly over uneven roads. Steering was vague and disconnected, giving the driver little confidence in tight maneuvers or emergency situations, while the brakes offered inconsistent stopping power that made even moderate traffic stressful to navigate. Safety, unsurprisingly, was minimal. The car's structural rigidity was poor, leaving occupants vulnerable in the event of a collision. Its braking, handling, and suspension weaknesses combined to make emergency situations especially hazardous. Drivers quickly learned that evasive maneuvers could send the car skidding or rolling unpredictably, particularly on wet or uneven roads.
It is no exaggeration to say that the Marina was not merely unremarkable, it was actively dangerous. British mechanics who dealt with the car in droves during its short-lived career have long referred to it as the stupidest car of all time, a damning assessment that encompasses its appearance, mechanical failings, and its tendency to frustrate everyone unfortunate enough to own or drive one. The Marina's build quality was notoriously poor. Rushed assembly lines, minimal quality control, and cheap materials meant that components failed with alarming regularity. Electrical gremlins, corroding body panels, and rattling interior trim were common complaints. Rust quickly became an endemic problem, particularly in the UK's damp climate, with floor pans, sills, and wheel arches deteriorating far faster than expected. Mechanical failures were almost inevitable. Engines overheating, clutches giving out, gear selectors jamming, and suspension components wearing out far ahead of schedule. Drivers spent more time repairing their vehicles than actually driving them, and owning a Marina demanded patience, a well-stocked toolbox, and a resilient sense of humor. On the road, the Marina's failures were plain for all to see. It struggled to reach highway speeds, its acceleration was lethargic, and its handling made even modest corners a source of tension. Long-distance travel was a chore. The cabin rattled incessantly, the engine droned endlessly, and every imperfection in the road was transmitted directly into the driver's hands and spine. Owners often recounted embarrassing experiences of being overtaken by much smaller or slower vehicles, enduring constant mechanical failures, and coping with the endless quirks and frailties of the car. Culturally, the Morris Marina became a symbol of British automotive hubris and decline. It was a car that promised to challenge the rising Japanese imports, but failed spectacularly, demonstrating how cutting corners and prioritizing speed to market over engineering competence can result in catastrophic outcomes. Drivers and enthusiasts alike remember it not fondly, but as a warning, a source of humor, and for mechanics, a near daily nightmare. It has entered popular automotive mythology as one of the worst mainstream cars ever produced, often cited alongside other infamously flawed vehicles as an example of design, engineering, and manufacturing failure. Its legacy is a mix of derision and reluctant nostalgia. Surviving examples are rare, and when found, they are often preserved as objects of curiosity rather than practical transportation. Owning a Marina today is a statement, an acknowledgement of its history as a car that was rushed, ugly, unreliable, and dangerous, a monument to what happens when ambition meets incompetence. It reminds us of a time when British Leyland was desperate to compete, but lacked the resources and foresight to create a vehicle that could survive in the real world, leaving drivers, passengers, and mechanics alike to cope with the consequences. In short, the 1970 Morris Marina was a car that failed spectacularly on every level. Its design was bland, its mechanical reliability questionable, its handling dangerous, and its reputation so poor that it has endured for decades as the quintessential example of British automotive folly. Driving a Marina was less about transportation and more about endurance, patience, and surviving constant mechanical absurdities, a truly unforgettable testament to the dangers of cutting corners, rushing production, and underestimating the competition. If you want, I can expand this even further into a full-length, immersive narrative, following a British family or commuter for a year, as they endure daily breakdowns, hazardous drives, interior annoyances, mechanical chaos, public ridicule, and all the unforgettable horrors of living with the Morris Marina, turning it into a darkly comic, novel-length chronicle of automotive misery. Do you want me to do that?
The 1985 Zastava Koral is not merely a car. It is an audacious exercise in automotive absurdity, a relic of outdated design thrust into a world that had long since advanced beyond it. Often sold abroad under the name Yugo, it was essentially a rebadged and slightly modified Fiat 128, a car that had been revolutionary when it debuted in the early 1970s. By the mid-1980s, however, it was hopelessly obsolete. Slow, underpowered, uncomfortable, mechanically fragile, and aesthetically behind the times by at least a decade. Yet it was aggressively marketed in Western countries as a new, affordable car. A bold move that shocked consumers, confounded mechanics, and left a trail of disbelief and humor in its wake. The exterior of the Koral is a study in unremarkable mediocrity. Its boxy, angular body lacks charm or elegance, with flat panels, awkward proportions, and design cues that scream early 1970s to anyone with eyes. The car has no presence on the road beyond its diminutive size, making it almost invisible among modern traffic. Small details like flimsy bumpers, thin steel panels prone to corrosion, and basic lighting fixtures reinforce the sense that this vehicle was built with minimum cost in mind, with little consideration for longevity or aesthetics. It has the personality of a stapler, functional in theory, utterly forgettable in practice. Step inside, and the Koral's deficiencies become even more obvious. The interior is painfully sparse, dominated by cheap plastics, thinly padded seats, and minimal instrumentation. Drivers and passengers are crammed into a tiny cabin where ergonomics seem almost deliberately neglected. The controls are awkwardly positioned, the steering wheel sits too close to the knees, and the seats offer no comfort or lateral support. Long drives become exercises in endurance, with every bump and pothole transmitted directly to the occupants. The heating system is primitive, ventilation marginal, and road noise is amplified by the car's lack of insulation, making even a short trip an exhausting affair. Mechanically, the Koral is a relic, a machine that was outdated before it left the factory. Its small inline-4 engine produces modest power, enough to move the car along flat terrain, but insufficient for anything resembling spirited driving. Acceleration is sluggish, overtaking on highways is nerve-wracking, and the engine struggles when the car is loaded with passengers or cargo. The gearbox is crude and imprecise, often clunky and reluctant to engage properly, while the suspension produces a harsh, bouncy ride that feels both unstable and uncomfortable. Steering is vague, brakes are underwhelming, and the car's weight distribution is awkward, creating unpredictable handling that turned even minor maneuvers into tense exercises in caution. On wet or uneven roads, the Koral can feel perilously unstable, rewarding every overconfidence with wobbling, understeer, or unexpected sliding. Reliability was a major concern. While the engine and drivetrain were mechanically simple, making repairs theoretically possible with basic tools, the quality of materials and assembly was inconsistent. Electrical issues, cooling failures, and fuel system quirks were common, and many cars required constant maintenance just to remain operational. Body panels rusted quickly, particularly in harsher climates, and replacement parts were often difficult to source outside of Yugoslavia, leaving owners stranded or forced into improvisation. The result was a car that demanded vigilance, patience, and a certain sense of humor, as owners navigated a daily gauntlet of breakdowns, rattles, leaks, and minor mechanical catastrophes. The Koral's shortcomings were compounded by its attempt to compete in Western markets, where expectations had shifted dramatically. In the United States and parts of Western Europe, buyers were accustomed to cars that were not only functional, but also reliable, safe, and modern in design. The Koral's slow acceleration, poor ergonomics, and fragile mechanics made it a source of amusement, frustration, and even disbelief. Driving one on highways was a nerve-wracking experience. Overtaking trucks or faster cars demanded careful calculation, a prayer, and a constant awareness of the car's limitations.
Parking and city driving were tolerable only because of the car's tiny footprint. Yet even here, the lack of structural integrity and poor handling reminded drivers of its inherent dangers. Culturally, the Koral became infamous, not for its virtues, but for its audacious attempt to masquerade as a modern vehicle decades past its prime. It symbolizes the dangers of outdated design, rushed licensing deals, and automotive hubris, becoming a punchline in countless reviews, stories, and jokes. Collectors and enthusiasts today often celebrate it ironically, appreciating its absurdity and the chaotic charm of surviving with one. Tales of breakdowns at inconvenient times, overheated engines, failed brakes, and the sheer embarrassment of being overtaken by far less capable vehicles became part of the Koral's enduring legend. For many Western buyers in the 1980s, owning a Koral was a constant lesson in humility, patience, and coping with the consequences of purchasing a car from the wrong decade. The legacy of the Zastava Koral is therefore of caution, ridicule, and ironic nostalgia. Its tiny engine, primitive suspension, awkward handling, and outdated design made it a mechanical anachronism, while its Western marketing promised a modern, affordable car that it could never deliver. It's remembered as an emblem of ambition gone awry, a symbol of how easily automotive history can produce something simultaneously functional, in the loosest sense, yet profoundly flawed in every meaningful way. Driving a Koral was an endurance exercise, a constant balancing act between keeping it moving, avoiding accidents, and maintaining the thin veneer of dignity as the car wheezed and rattled along. In short, the 1985 Zastava Koral was outdated, mechanically fragile, poorly designed, uncomfortable, and dangerously obsolete from the moment it left the factory. Its attempt to enter Western markets was bold but misguided, making it infamous as one of the most absurd cars ever sold outside its home country. It's a car defined by compromise, low expectations, and mechanical mediocrity. A vehicle whose legacy endures not for its performance or beauty, but for its audacious existence, and the endless stories of frustration, hilarity, and disbelief it inspired in everyone who ever had the misfortune or curiosity to own one.
The 1969 NSU Ro 80 is one of those cars that immediately captures attention with its futuristic styling, sleek aerodynamic body, and advanced engineering, yet simultaneously inspires frustration, despair, and disbelief due to one critical flaw: its revolutionary Wankel rotary engine. At the time of its launch, the Ro 80 was hailed as a technological marvel, a car so far ahead of its contemporaries that it looked as though it had materialized from the future rather than the late 1960s. Its wedge-shaped body, clean lines, and aerodynamic efficiency set it apart from the bulky, angular sedans of the era, giving it a presence on the road that was striking, almost otherworldly. The interior reflected the same forward-thinking approach: a minimalist yet elegant dashboard, spacious seating for 4 adults, and thoughtful ergonomics that made it feel modern and luxurious, a true driver's car in terms of comfort and design. The promise of the Ro 80 lay in its Wankel rotary engine, a small, high-revving, compact unit that was supposed to deliver smooth, vibration-free performance and virtually unlimited longevity. On paper, it was revolutionary: fewer moving parts, a lighter and more compact design than conventional piston engines, and a promise of reliability. In practice, however, the rotary engine proved catastrophically fragile. The apex seals, crucial to maintaining compression and proper operation, wore out far too quickly, often within 20 to 30,000 miles. Engines overheated, burned oil, and frequently suffered complete failure, leaving owners facing expensive rebuilds or replacements. A car that seemed like the pinnacle of innovation had in reality one of the most unreliable power plants ever installed in a luxury sedan, creating a tension between its brilliance and its practicality.
Driving the Ro 80 was an experience of contradiction. The suspension, body balance, and aerodynamics made it glide over roads with poise and comfort that rivaled cars decades newer. Steering was precise for its time, the ride smooth, and the cabin insulated passengers from much of the outside world's noise and vibration. On curves and highways, it felt remarkably agile and composed, a testament to NSU's engineering skill. Yet all of this brilliance existed under the constant shadow of the engine's fragility. No matter how expertly one drove, the inevitable mechanical failure could strike without warning, turning the otherwise elegant, futuristic machine into a stranded, smoking hunk of metal. This juxtaposition of advanced sophistication and catastrophic unreliability is why owners famously referred to it as the world's smartest stupid car, a brilliant concept entirely undermined by flawed execution. Reliability issues were compounded by the complexity of the Wankel engine. Mechanics were unfamiliar with rotary technology, spare parts were limited, and repairs were both costly and time-consuming. Electrical components, though not extraordinary for the era, were basic and sometimes erratic, adding minor frustrations to the daily experience. The Ro 80 was a car that demanded careful, almost obsessive maintenance, yet even this could not prevent the apex seals from wearing prematurely. Owners quickly learned that owning a Ro 80 meant not just enjoying its futuristic looks and comfortable ride, but constantly worrying about whether it would survive the next 50 miles of driving. The cultural impact of the Ro 80 is defined by this tension between admiration and exasperation. It is widely recognized as a car ahead of its time, influencing automotive design with its aerodynamics, cabin layout, and modern approach to driver comfort. Yet its reputation is forever tarnished by its mechanical shortcomings. Automotive enthusiasts, historians, and casual observers alike often describe it with a mix of reverence and incredulity. Here was a car that promised the future, delivered elegance and innovation, and yet failed spectacularly at its most essential function, keeping its engine alive. In many ways, it has become a symbol of both the brilliance and hubris of automotive engineering, a cautionary tale of how innovation can falter when critical execution fails. Even decades later, surviving Ro 80s are celebrated more for their design, historical significance, and bold engineering than for practicality. When restored and maintained, they offer a glimpse into a vision of automotive futurism that few cars of the late 1960s could match. But for the original owners, the reality was far harsher. Breakdowns, expensive repairs, and the constant anxiety of engine failure were unavoidable companions. Driving a Ro 80 meant balancing admiration for its design with dread of its flaws, creating an emotional roller coaster that only the bravest, or perhaps most masochistic drivers could endure. In short, the 1969 NSU Ro 80 is the ultimate paradox in automotive history. It combined cutting-edge aerodynamic design, luxurious comfort, and engineering innovation with an engine so unreliable that it undermined the car's entire promise. Driving it was a constant mix of exhilaration, pride, and anxiety, a car that could thrill, charm, and terrify in equal measure. Its nickname, the world's smartest stupid car, perfectly captures its essence, a vehicle of incredible ingenuity, crippled by its own central flaw, forever remembered as a triumph and a disaster all at once. If you want, I can expand this into a full-length, immersive narrative chronicling a Ro 80 owner's experiences over a year or more, including daily drives, breakdowns, roadside repairs, mechanical nightmares, and the emotional highs and lows of living with one of the most brilliant yet frustrating cars ever built. This could turn into a darkly comic, novel-length account of admiration, obsession, and automotive despair.
The 1987 Hyundai Excel is a car that represents the unpolished beginnings of a now global automotive powerhouse, a vehicle that, in hindsight, is almost laughably inept, yet played a pivotal role in introducing Hyundai to markets far beyond South Korea. Launched with bold ambition, the Excel was intended to be an affordable, entry-level car that could compete with Japanese imports dominating the 1980s, particularly in the United States.
In reality, it succeeded in drawing attention, but for all the wrong reasons. Cheap construction, flimsy materials, laughably basic engineering, and a reliability record so poor that it quickly earned a reputation as a throwaway car. At first glance, the Excel looked innocuous enough, a tiny, boxy hatchback or sedan with conservative styling that tried to appeal to mass-market sensibilities. But every glance at its bodywork revealed compromises made to keep costs down. Thin steel panels rattled in even the gentlest breeze, doors refused to close with a satisfying clunk, and trim pieces often warped or fell off entirely. Its proportions were awkward, with stubby overhangs and a squat stance, giving it the appearance of a cheap toy rather than a vehicle designed for real-world roads. Windows rattled, interior panels flexed under the slightest pressure, and paint was thin and prone to corrosion, indicating that longevity was clearly not a priority during design or production. Inside, the Excel offered little in the way of comfort or refinement. Hard, brittle plastics dominated the cabin, and seats were so thinly padded that even short drives left passengers sore and fatigued. Controls were cheap, imprecise, and awkwardly placed, with steering and pedals that lacked responsiveness. Heating and ventilation systems were minimal, producing inconsistent airflow, while road noise penetrated the cabin with unrelenting persistence. For a car intended for urban commuting and family errands, it was uncomfortable, unpleasant, and occasionally infuriating to operate. Mechanically, the Excel's shortcomings were even more glaring. Its small engines, designed for economy rather than performance, struggled to move the car with passengers or cargo aboard. Acceleration was lethargic, and climbing even moderate inclines became a test of patience. The gearbox was crude, often producing grinding noises, missed shifts, or a vague, disconnected feel behind the wheel. Suspension and handling were rudimentary, producing a bouncy, unstable ride that made cornering a tense exercise in hope rather than skill. Steering was light but vague, offering minimal feedback, while brakes were inconsistent, especially under prolonged use, leading to unnerving stopping distances in traffic. Reliability, which Hyundai desperately needed to establish credibility in Western markets, was disastrously low. Owners faced frequent breakdowns, failing electrical systems, rust, overheating engines, and transmissions that faltered long before reaching any reasonable mileage. Spare parts were limited, and repairs were often complicated by the Excel's minimalist engineering, forcing owners into a cycle of temporary fixes and recurring issues. Car reviewers in the United States and Europe didn't mince their words. While the Excel's low price was attractive, its build quality and reliability were abysmal. It became synonymous with cheap disposability, a car that many buyers assumed would last barely a year or two before significant repairs became unavoidable. The cultural impact of the Excel in the West was both immediate and lasting. It introduced Hyundai to new markets, yes, but it did so in a way that cemented the brand's early reputation for producing low-quality, throwaway vehicles. For many consumers, the Excel was emblematic of everything wrong with cheap imports of the era: underpowered, unreliable, poorly built, and barely safe. Stories of rattling panels, failed engines, overheating, and owners stranded on highways became common, feeding into jokes, memes, and cautionary tales for decades. Mechanics who encountered the car were both frustrated and bemused, often warning owners that extensive maintenance was essential just to keep the car marginally functional. Despite its glaring flaws, the Excel has earned a peculiar kind of historical significance. It represents the starting point for Hyundai's rise as a global car manufacturer, a humble and deeply flawed vehicle from which the company would learn hard lessons about quality, engineering, and market expectations. Its legacy is thus a paradox: reviled for its defects, yet respected as a foundation upon which Hyundai could eventually build the reliable, well-regarded cars we know today. The Excel's shortcomings were brutally obvious: cheap interior, fragile bodywork, unreliable drivetrain, and poor handling. It demanded patience, ingenuity, and acceptance that mechanical failures were inevitable. Driving it was less about enjoyment and more about survival, an endurance test for anyone naive enough to purchase one expecting modern standards. In short, the 1987 Hyundai Excel was an inexpensive, underpowered, and poorly constructed car that introduced Hyundai to the world in the most unflattering fashion possible. Cheap, flimsy, unreliable, and prone to breakdowns, it earned a reputation as a throwaway car and provided countless stories of frustration, embarrassment, and mechanical chaos for its owners. Yet, it also represents the very beginning of Hyundai's journey towards global automotive respectability, a starting point defined by ambition undermined by execution. A car remembered for all its flaws and for the lessons it forced both the company and its buyers to learn.